Ik hoor nog niks. Horen jullie mij? Via de, ja, oké. So now I switch to English. It's great that you all came here to talk about taxes. Actually, every year when we have the Africa Day, there's also a part on taxation. And why is it so important? Because, well, if you want countries to get their own resources and get their own taxes, we should make it possible for countries to collect their own taxes. And we have the big problem of international tax avoidance, where companies set up complicated structures. And, well, a lot of countries lose money from this, but especially developing countries, they lose the most. I think we're at an interesting time to have this discussion together, because we had this week actually, there was debate in the United Nations on taxation. Do you actually know, just to feel how much you all know about taxation, which organization internationally where most agreements are made, actually? The OECD, yes, that's right. And so that's what we actually want to change, because the OECD is not representing all countries. They say they do sometimes, but they don't. And even, well, they set up the inclusive framework, which is a bigger group of countries than only the OECD. But it's still it doesn't compare to the United Nations. So what we want is to have agreements internationally done in the United Nations. Last year, a resolution was adopted about a year ago. A resolution of the African group within the United Nations, saying like we should set up a global framework within the UN to discuss taxation. And of course, this will mean that the role of the OECD has to diminish, so that they have to make place for the UN. But this will be really like a major shift. But now we have momentum, because this resolution is adopted a year ago. And now, last week, they were actually talking about how we go further from here. I have two guests for you that are going to tell about this. And after that, we'll have a panel discussion. There are 3 seats, so it's the 2 speakers, and Henrique from Oxfam will be added. The first speaker, I will, Aize, where is, oh, you sit over there. Yeah, is Aize, Aisha. Aisha. Sorry, I say it wrong. Aize, from the IBFD. And IBFD is the International Bureau of Fiscal Documentation, and the IBFD is actually is an international organization, but it has its head office very close to here, actually. And they are an expert on fiscal taxation. It's not like Oxfam, or any other organization like. Trying to push a certain agenda, but more like looking at from an expert, neutral way at the developments. I give the floor to Aisha.
This is not settling down well. Yeah, thank you. Yes. Okay, yes, I finally figured it out. So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad to be here with you and to get this opportunity to speak on this topic, which is at the center of international discussion currently. And so as to manage the time, so we go to the more interactive aspects of this session, I would try to jump into my presentation now without any further delay. And to do this topic justice, where we keep talking, I'm sure you've been hearing a lot about inclusiveness and effectiveness of international tax cooperation of recent. So to do it justice, I have organized my presentation to give a background and overview of the international architecture we have when it comes to taxation. So I will give a brief overview of the development of the international principles we have now and how they still exist, the major organizations that have influenced these developments. And I'll look at it vis-a-vis the role Africa has played in this discussion. We'll also talk about the UN Resolution 77-44, which is the purpose of this discussion now, and some of the major contents of that report. So to start, the current international framework we have and the tax rules we have can be traced up as far back as the 1920s. And by the 1920s, we're talking about the League of Nations work, where they got 4 economists to look into the problem of double taxation and how to eliminate double taxation. And what we also want to see from that is that they went into the principles of taxation and the theories behind taxation. We saw a shift from what we call the principle of the exchange theory, which was based on the social contract theory, whereby the state would obligate you to pay taxes to it because of the services and benefits it can provide to you. And there was a shift from this to what we have as the ability to pay, which says you have been provided these services that enables you to create wealth. And then as a compensation for this, a certain portion should be given back to the state. So all the good parts of the exchange theory is what's in the ability to pay theory. And there was a shift also from what we have political allegiance, or what we call political allegiance, whereby you were entitled to pay based on citizenship and the obligations that you had to a state of identity. But then you're shifting to what is or was termed economic allegiance, where we're talking about your economic ties and the closeness or the strength of your economic ties to a particular jurisdiction. So the major outcome of this was that we designed rules, or rules were designed that talked about the objective or the what was identified primarily from this work was which jurisdiction was entitled to pay, or you were entitled to pay tax to. And the major outcome in this was the identification of 2 major jurisdictions that posed or had the highest strength of economic links to. And that's the place or the origin of wealth, or where you source your income from, and where you are domiciled or resident. And in modern day taxation, that's what we call the principles of residence state taxation, source state taxation. But not to bore you with all this, we'll go to the fun parts. But at some point, we'll come back to why taxing rights is very important in this discussion. So to give a background and layout to things, it's good to also note the context in which these rules were developed. It will help you appreciate what was developed, why certain people participated to a certain extent more than others, and why the rules are the way they are. So we have mentioned the League of Nations, and the League of Nations operated from 1919 to 1946, and it originally had 42 founding members. By its dissolution in 1946, there were like 63 members. Majority of these countries were developed countries, as we would call them, and around this time, what was the environment, socially and politically, when it was established. So Industrial Revolution had come in, there was increased trade and investment. It had expanded to cross-border trade and investment. There was the problem with double taxation because of that spread and expansion of business. We had also just had World War I. Economies were trying to recover, so it was at the focus point of them to have economic recovery through trade and investment. And so the International Chambers of Commerce had called for the League of Nations to look into the problem of double taxation and the extent to which it was impeding on cross-border taxation, cross-border trade and investment, sorry. And so for developing countries, what was that? Well, what we currently call developing countries, at that point, majority of them were still under colonial rule. The few that were independent, mostly in Latin America, were the dominant players in this discussion, but of that time, they still had very rudimentary tax systems. So it was just very few people that had sophisticated tax systems that had this as a problem. So it wasn't even a major problem for most countries. And then for Africa, well, there was South Africa in 1939, but as of most of the time, it was still under what we called an autonomous dominion of the British colony. So there was little influence of developed countries from Africa in these discussions. And what were the discussions? During the work of the League of Nations, we had multiple things that were created then. We had mentioned the basic principles of taxation, which was developed during this period and which continue to exist till today. We also had, and with that work, we had three models come out. One in 1928. We had also a London model and a Mexico model that also came out in the 1940s. And in the 1930s, the concretization of the transfer pricing principles we have now for profit attribution was done. There was a research that was done by Mitchell B. Carroll, and well, South Africa was included in the research he did, but that was the extent to it. So there was very little influence of Africa in this whole discussion and the development of these roles. And another key thing or fundamental thing is, I had mentioned two models came out, and during the Second World War, at the start of the Second World War, most of the discussions was still held by the League, but was done in Mexico. And that's what created what we have as the Mexico model, which is representing the first attempt to create rules in which there is more allocation to source states. So generally, the principles that were laid out in the 1928 model favored resident state taxation more than source state taxation, but this is just a problem of who is capital exporting. At that period of time, I had mentioned most people were recovering from First World War, and the strongest of the economies, even amongst the developed countries, was London, giving out a lot of loans during that period, and it was able to dictate a lot into the rules and how they were developed. And so we had a model that favored more allocation of taxing rights to resident states. That's the capital exporter. And the logic behind it is, well, we want to develop different economies, and to develop different economies, you have to remove that restriction of taxation that you have, so you can attract investment to your jurisdiction. So, in 1946, the League of Nations was dissolved, and the UN came up as the successor and assumed all the roles and liabilities and assets of the League of Nations. And so it was expected to continue this discussion. However, what had happened was that in 1946, we had just finished World War II. So again, European countries were trying to recover their economies. Majority of the developing world was still under colonial rule, but there was the first wave of decolonization. So some countries had started receiving independence. There was that whole period of the Cold War. So there was a lot of proxy wars and a lot of economic tension. There was that whole divide between the South and the North. And this was these were some of the factors that led to the failure of the UN to be able to carry on this activity of development of rules, because of lack of consensus amongst members on agreeing on the best way forward and accepting maybe the Mexico model and more sourcing rights and all. And so in 1954, the UN was also dissolved. The UN Fiscal Committee was dissolved, to be specific. The UN as an organization continued, but when it comes to tax issues, there was a vacuum that needed to be filled. And so in 1955, the OECD took over this role. And it said, we have this problem. There's no one to bring direction to it, and that's harmonization of taxing rights. And so we need to do something to be able to make rules coherent amongst members and to coordinate things so that we could still push for this whole investment and broadening of cross-border investment. So the OECD took on the role, has dominated the discussion till today. In 1980s, actually in the late 1970s, the UN started taking up a more prominent role in this discussion, trying to balance out for developing countries. So the UN came back and said, okay, we'll bring an alternative model in which would allocate more sourcing rights to taxing rights to the source state, and we'll try and balance out the asymmetries that the OECD would do. Now, what you have to also note is, what is the makeup of the OECD? A narrow group of countries, mostly developed countries, trying to push their own interests. And so what would favor them is something that says residents, each country will tax its residents. But then when you are trying to attract investment, which happened in the 1960s, where the decolonization started proper for most of Africa and Asia, then you want to attract foreign investment. And so you would need something that would still allow you to attract foreign investment, but would not make you cede all your taxing rights, that you don't receive any income. And so this is the polarity that we have in the international system, where there is the OECD, there's the UN also on the other hand, and then we are all aware of the BEPS work, and rules were developed also at the call of the G20 and with the giving a mandate to the OECD to look into these problems. After the final reports came out in 2015, there was calls for broad implementation of the rules, and so it needed to be broadly implemented by many countries as possible. And so it was opened up more to developing countries, and we now have the inclusive framework. And the inclusive framework is a framework that brings in developing countries to discussing at equal footing with the OECD countries and to develop rules to monitor the implementation of the BEPS rules also. The G20 has some countries that are from the global south, which are Argentina, Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, South Africa, and because of their membership, it is the impression that they do involve themselves in the agenda setting of the rules. So what was the issues what are the issues with the existing framework? The issues that have been identified was that there was, as we mentioned, an asymmetry in the allocation of taxing rights. It was mostly to resident states, not to source states. So that was criticized highly. The system was fragmented. We have mentioned there were rules being created by the UN and then the OECD, by the OECD, and then the UN would try to respond to it, also creating another set of rules to help developing countries. There was also inadequate representation of developing countries throughout the whole development of all the rules, as we mentioned. And maybe a key thing to bring into perspective is the UN structure. So it has a body called the Committee of Experts, Tax Experts, which is a group of 25 persons, all nominated by their governments, but working in their personal capacity. So it does not have the legitimization of rules developed under the OECD, which is negotiated by governments, representatives. So we also mentioned another key issue was the lack of consideration for low capacity jurisdictions. And when we talk about that, we're talking about the time constraints that were involved in the development of rules. We also mentioned that at a certain time, actually for developing countries up till the 1980s, most of them had very rudimentary tax systems. So you're talking about transfer pricing when people came into a tax structure that was a head tax. So these were concepts that most people were not used to and were not conversant with, and so they were not able to put in as much influence into the development. And with the digital economy, more issues had come up when it comes to BEPS issues and also the inadequacy of the existing rules, and these have not still been addressed. We have the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 rules. I don't know if you have heard of that. It is supposed to create a new taxing right to deal with the digital economy. That was the intention. But now there's this rule that gives a taxing right above the existing rules we have. So an overlay to the existing tax rules, whereby you can tax if you have derived certain income from an M&E, or if an M&E has derived income from your jurisdiction based on an allocation of a portion of their residual profits. And so we're talking about residual profits of big M&Es, that's 20 billion and above, with a profit margin of above 10%. And the issue is we have taxing rights and we want a fairer balance of taxing rights. And then we also said, there's a problem with the rules being applied with digital economy, because now you don't need physical presence to do business in a location. And the rules that were originally there needed a nexus that is based on physical presence. But this has not been addressed. Okay, so time is flying. Okay, yes. So I've just been warned that my time is flying, so let me wrap up. So these are some of the criticisms of the rules, and to skip to why we are here. So by December 2022, the African group under the African Union brought up a new resolution which they pushed to the UN General Assembly, calling for a more inclusive and effective international tax environment and cooperation. And it said, we have all these issues. We've not really been included effectively in the development of rules, and they are inadequate for us. And we feel the OECD is no more representing a fair platform for this development. And so, based on that resolution, the Secretary General was told to look into the issue and come up with a plan on a way forward on addressing it. And one of the key things was bringing in that development under the UN, and to be inclusive and effective, you have to look at the substantive parts of it and the procedural parts of the system. That means agenda setting must be open to all, because we focus on the priorities of developed countries, not developing countries. The agenda setting also, so they must be participating in the discussion on equal footing. The agenda setting should be looking at the priorities of each person and their capacity. And then the decision making should be transparent and clear. It should take into consideration capacities of others, giving them time to look at what has been produced and bring up informed observations and discussions concerning the rules that have been developed. Then you also bring up implementation and monitoring, looking at the procedures and capacities also of each person and the resources that are needed for the effective implementation of such rules, and a dispute resolution mechanism that would be fair and would seem fair to everyone.
I think we have to finish.
Yes, so,
People still want to have
yes, so
at the end.
I'm going to round up with this slide.
Yeah.
And so the Secretary General had brought up 3 options of a way forward. And one of them was to look into a multilateral tax convention, which was a binding and legal convention, and would set out the rules that need to be the new rules, and everyone will have to agree on those rules. But historically, we've not been able to get many people to agree on things. So this was looked at as unrealistic. The second option was a framework convention whereby you would have a convention based on principles that you want to abide in. Currently, the UN talks a lot about sustainable development based on domestic revenue, to aid domestic revenue mobilization. And so you have that type of principle based on equality and fairness, and then you have protocols that have the substantive rules where countries will be able to opt in and opt out. But the main framework convention would be binding. So this is a better rule. Most countries see it as a best way forward. And then there was a third one, which was non-binding, but was a framework on international cooperation generally, whereby it would be non-binding, but it would just look at regional coordination of discussions and bringing up issues that are germane to a particular region, and then it would be open for discussion on a larger platform. This was highly criticized, and because of its non-binding nature. Currently, discussions are focusing on a framework convention. There's a second committee that was set up to look at this. By the 21st of this month, they should be looking at a redraft of the UN resolution on the way forward. So that is the state of play as of now. And we hope that things move the way we want and we get what is expected in this new reform of how taxes and are developed, and how taxation principles are developed and norms and standards. So I hope that was a rush,
Thank you.
but I hope you covered everything.
Yeah, thank you very much. We'll have questions later after the both speakers. Thank you, Aisha. It's yeah, so hard to do within such a short time frame to also yeah, all this information. But I think things will become more clear after the next speaker because Ishmael Zulu of the of Tax Justice Network Africa will talk about the same, also about this process of the UN. These three options are now really important because they are discussed now. So I give the floor to Ishmael Zulu.
Thank you so much, Arnold. I think my name is easier than Aisha. You're doing well. I'll quickly open my presentation. Hope this doesn't take too long. Yes. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be here with you. I'm glad that you've decided to stay on this long. I know it's a bit late in the day. I'm a bit surprised. This is 4 p.m. now, and the sun is already going down. Back home, we still have about 2 to 3 hours of sunlight. But yeah, I'll be looking at, so based off of Aisha's presentation, I have the weight of carrying my continent, Africa, and seeing where we fit into this global tax system and what that means for us as an African continent. And we have, so I realized when I was going through my slides last minute that I have this lady here. She appears in a lot of my slides. So I decided to name her Nelly after my daughter. So you'll be seeing her quite often, and she's always asking questions. And I'll try as much as possible to respond to those questions. So yeah, we have a current international tax system, and taking away the technicalities, there are over 3,000 bilateral tax treaties in place at the moment, which are based off of different principles such as the arm's length principle, principles of permanent establishment, source and residence taxation, like Aisha was speaking. And when you look at all of that and you piece it together, unfortunately for African countries, it has proven quite unfair. And what it has resulted in is, I'll summarize it in three things. Each of them can be widened. So one, there's a race to the bottom. When I say race to the bottom, I mean in terms of taxation, several countries, forgive me, tend to race to the bottom when it comes to taxation. So I'm from Zambia. In Zambia, if the government decides, for mining companies, we'll reduce the corporate income tax rate from 20% to 10%. Our neighboring country like Zimbabwe will think, if Zambia is doing that, we should also reduce how much we are charging. We should reduce it to 10%. And then several countries begin doing this, and this is what we're calling a race to the bottom. There have been issues of tax avoidance that have happened, especially by the large multinationals, and there have also been profit shifting practices, again by the large corporate multinationals. And within the context of our financing needs on the African continent, on account of COVID-19, there was a loss of output, which amounted to 115 billion. In addition to this, there were 40 million people that were pushed into poverty. And I know this, we're just looking at it in the form of numbers, but then you begin thinking about what that means. There's 40 million families that had a livelihood, but lost that livelihood and have been pushed into extreme poverty on account of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the post-recovery financing gap is over 340 billion US dollars. In addition to this, the financing gap for Africa meeting the Sustainable Development Goals ranges from $269 billion to about $279 billion. So in total, when you put all of these financing gaps together, we're at a total gap of 600 to 630 billion US dollars per year. This is every year. There's this financing gap, which is so huge. And within the conversation of global tax reform, the best solution for Africa is for us to be able to raise our resources ourselves. We can't rely on aid and requesting for money from developed countries, official development assistance, but it's for us. We have minerals in Africa. We have economic activity that takes place within Africa. The way we're able to tax this wealth speaks now, brings into question the global financial architecture. Does Africa have room on the table to shape global tax policy? And these are the problems that were highlighted by Aisha earlier on. So in terms of global tax reform, what we want to see in this reform is, one, how the agenda is set in terms of discussing tax policy. 2, transparency processes in terms of shaping tax policy. 3, there's issues of governance. And then lastly, and very importantly, inclusivity based off of equal contribution to the shaping of tax policy. And substantively, the goal for us as African countries is to increase revenue available for governments, for government expenditure in itself, and then investing in the domestic economies. So we are currently concerned about issues of base erosion and profit shifting. It affects everyone, developed countries and developing countries, but more so for developing countries, because any little resources that are taken away really has an impact on the way governments can shape development. There's also aggressive tax avoidance and then taxing of the digital economy, which is a very, very contentious topic now, because we have several digital companies that are making billions, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. You saw how many digital companies saw increasing revenue and increasing profits, but there's limitations into how we can tax those profits. This makes us question now who shapes global tax policy, and this is this was seen in the earlier on presentation. So there's the UN Tax Committee that Aisha made reference to. We have institutions such as the IMF, who has a role in shaping tax policy. There's institutions such as the World Bank. There's the elephant in the room, which is the OECD. Then we have G20, G7 countries. And in Africa, there's ATAF, the African Tax Administration Forum, and the African Development Bank. So I'll focus on 3. The first one is the G7 countries. You might have heard in the presentation earlier on when we were talking about the OECD 2-pillar solution. And one of those pillars looks at bringing a global minimum tax on account of the activities of tax havens. Certain countries that reduce their tax system to as low as 0 to attract a lot of companies there, which would make a lot of, because they operate in several countries, they would shift all their profits to the low tax jurisdiction. So as a solution, we proposed a global minimum tax of 15%. This global minimum tax was spearheaded by 7 countries only. These are members of the G7. They're the ones who spearheaded it, and through the OECD made it global. Secondly, we have institutions such as the G20. The G20 were key also in the shaping of the BEPS package, the base erosion and profit shifting package, where we came up with 15 actions to address profit shifting and tax avoidance. Now, when we look at the political economy, so we've looked at 2. I'll come to the third, which is the OECD. And at present, there is not a single entity that exists that has the global legitimacy to serve as the single coordinating body for international tax cooperation. The closest that we have to this is the OECD, where they have their inclusive framework. And so for countries that want to talk about international tax rules, they have to be a part of the OECD. Now, we call it the inclusive framework. So again, we see Nelly asking questions here, and let's try to respond to that question. Is it inclusive? So for me as an African, let's say I'm from Zambia, right? If as Zambia I'm worried, so Zambia is a mineral-rich country. We have copper, we have cobalt. These are key minerals in terms of the green revolution, in terms of climate issues. So if as Zambia we're concerned with tax policy, how can we raise enough revenue from the copper that we have? We'll say, okay, there's an inclusive framework. So if Zambia approaches the OECD and says that we want to be a part of the inclusive framework, the OECD is going to hand us a document of 2,000 pages, which was negotiated without any input from Zambia. This was between the G20 countries and OECD countries, and in a process that excluded over 100 developing countries. They will hand us that document, say, before you can do anything, you must begin adopting these in your countries. And there's a minimum of 4 BEPS actions that a country must implement before they can say that they are part of the inclusive framework. They must pay an annual membership of 20,000 euros. And yeah, it's got a large membership as of at present, I think there are about 145 countries that have chosen to become members of the inclusive framework. In Africa, only around half are members of the inclusive framework. And essentially, over 1/3 of the world's countries are not participating in tax negotiations. So it's incorrect to say under the OECD that we have global agreements when 1/3 of world's countries are not participating meaningfully. So it's really important to reform how we're talking, and when we're using the word inclusive framework, when we're looking at the word of global agreements. So essentially, African countries have not been at the table. The way they engage in effecting international tax cooperation has been ineffective over for several years now. There has been a domination of developed economies in setting the agenda. This is due to financial reasons, the financial muscle that developed countries have, and also the technical capacity that developed economies has. And as a result, you find that some of the solutions that have been brought to play are ineffective because they don't take the consideration of some of the developing economies. And so for some of the principles that we agree with in the UN Secretary General report that looked at reforming international tax policy formulation, we completely agree with the following three: that the tax system must reflect universally applicable principles, and including the fundamental notion of equal sovereignty among all members. Secondly, the existing treaty-based rules for allocating rights to income and capital amongst jurisdiction allows for base erosion and profit shifting. Our current system that we have allows for profit shifting. And lastly, there's a two-pillar proposal. One pillar which is looking at taxing the digital economy. The second pillar which is looking at bringing about a global minimum tax. It is substantial. I have to give credit where it's due. I think it's a milestone in terms of shaping global tax policy. But unfortunately, it falls short of addressing some of the concerns that developing countries have. So these are the solutions that Aisha just ran through: a multilateral instrument, a framework convention. I did not finish editing this slide. I put framework convention twice. So let's just pretend we can see the third. Yeah. So what does the solution look like? Again, let's try to respond to Nelly lastly. So from the solution that the UN has brought about, we want to see four things. One, so we address the most pressing challenges in terms of international taxation, which of course the two-pillar solution by the OECD tries to do that. Secondly, accommodate the participation of all jurisdictions. Three, outline rules that are clear in their scope and nature. And lastly, ensuring simplicity to promote implementation by all nations. And this is specific for developing nations. Some of the solutions proposed can be complex, and developing countries are not able to implement these solutions because of the complexity, and as a result, you continue to lose tax revenue. So the only solution that tackles all of those issues is the second option on a United Nations Framework Convention. So it's the best option to foster equitable global economic development. So if we want an international tax system that is inclusive, fit for purpose, and balances the interest of developing and developed countries, the second option for a framework convention, which sees us developing a tax body under the UN as opposed to the OECD, is the best solution in our opinion. And you see, as I close, for us as developing countries, we are not saying that we want to be the ones who are shaping tax policy alone, bring tax policy formulation to Africa. No. All we're saying is we've been left behind. We're not at the table at several conversations. Our participation has been inadequate, has been ineffective. Let's come up with a platform which allows for equal contribution of both developed countries and developing countries. With that, I end my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ishmael. And you can stay here because now you're part of the panel. And I also ask Aisha and Henrique. And I can imagine maybe you have some questions as well. But I first want to give the floor to Henrique of Oxfam Novib to give a reaction.
Thank you very much, Arnold. Well, first of all, I just wanted to thank both speakers very much. Aisha and Ishmael was really interesting. And also, of course, I think it's interesting we get the different perspectives. So from Aisha, I think it's really an overview of what the situation is and how we got here. And from Ishmael, really the position from Tax Justice Network Africa, which I think it's, it's very interesting for all of us to be aware of that. So I'll just speak very briefly a little bit about the Dutch context. So as Ishmael showed here, basically what Tax Justice Network Africa and a lot of the civil society is involved in this, we see option 2 as the most interesting option, because that is really an option that would establish a permanent framework, a permanent tax body at the UN for the discussions that are necessary. Not surprisingly, the Netherlands is against the establishment of such a permanent tax body. I say not surprisingly because if you are aware of the role that the Netherlands plays in international taxation, you are probably aware that the Netherlands greatly benefits from the current status quo. So it's the view of Oxfam and of other Dutch NGOs and international NGOs that the Netherlands operates as a tax haven, that it basically has a very harmful impact on other countries and that it prevents those developing countries to actually generate the revenues that they need. So the Netherlands plays a very harmful role here, and they should hopefully play a much better and more positive role. The Netherlands, of course, it's part of the OECD, and being also part of the European Union, they follow, let's say, this position as a bloc. So very recently, one of our colleagues was in conversation with other EU countries, and they were basically saying, you know, we don't have the liberty to have a different position of what has been agreed at the EU level. So, of course, we see that also as a way of, running away from the responsibility of having a more interesting position, but it is something that is being said. One very interesting aspect that we have seen here in the Netherlands and also in other European countries is basically that by bringing this discussion to the UN level, now taxation is not only a matter for, let's say, finance ministries, but we see also that foreign affairs ministries are also getting into that conversation. And here there's a very interesting overlap between the ministries. Basically, we see that, the idea of a one view or a one position by a government, that's not how it really applies. Ministries have different views and different positions. So in general, it's Oxfam's view that the Foreign Affairs Ministry has had a more progressive and more positive view really about the role that taxation should have for developing countries. But we don't necessarily see that at the Finance Ministry. So there is really, let's say, this bit of an internal power struggle to see who will determine the way. And it looks for now that the Finance Ministry is winning that battle, but let's see. One more point I think is quite interesting is that now in October, there has been a parliamentary motion by the Socialist Party exactly to consider, the Netherlands having a more, let's say, positive view of a UN tax body. It has been defeated, but it at least shows that this is being, let's say, part of a broader conversation. So I think seeing all of you here, hopefully that it shows that there is some interest in society about this. And finally, earlier this year, the Netherlands, they published their Africa strategy, which is basically a view of how the Netherlands, should interact with African country. And my personal view is that the position that they're taking now goes very much against that. If the idea is to increase cooperation with African countries, is to have a more, let's say, equal conversation with them. At the same time, we are blocking them from being in the table for, such global discussions. And just to really wrap up here, I think more importantly is to see that those discussions, they don't happen in a vacuum. We're talking about geopolitics here. So not only the Netherlands, of course, but how other European countries, and when we're talking about the United States, let's say this Western bloc, how they will be, of course, very dependent of deals with Africa, going forward on climate, on migration, on agriculture, a lot of different issues that we will be facing in the near future. So at the same time that we know that, this partnership will be crucial, we are at the same time closing the door to them being part of these other discussions on taxes. And literally the last point is that I think it's important also, again, thinking geopolitics is how if the West is, behaving this way towards Africa. We have seen recently, either in the Financial Times or in other media reports of, African leaders saying that they are, very disappointed at the blocking stance of the EU and of the United States. It's important to think really also, how the West plans moving forward and how, the role of Russia and the role of China. So, for example, the view that we have here in the European Union of the conflict in Ukraine, that's not exactly the view that a lot of Africans, or I'm personally from Brazil, of countries in South America have of that conflict. And we see in Africa, in West Africa, there have recently been a number of military coups, which are apparently favorable to Russia. So there is really, again, this discussion doesn't happen in a vacuum. And it's important that the European Union sees that by closing the door to this, I would say, very legitimate request of the African nations, we are also closing the door to further cooperation in other areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Henrique. We've been together at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who is actually, I think they are listening to our story, and they're also willing, but it's indeed, we always have to do with several forces. So we also have to do with the Ministry of Finance, and it is hard to convince them. But we are in an interesting time because we also have elections coming up, so things can change. I think what is interesting, an argument that is used by the Ministry of Finance often. I think I will ask this question to you, Ishmael. So what they say is, well, we all have the same interest, don't we? As African countries, as European countries. So we're all in it together. So why would we need the United Nations? He used it as an argument like it is okay like it is now, isn't it? Because we all have the same interest. Okay. You can actually use sorry.
Yeah.
You can use this one.
So I respond now?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the challenge with the current system is that a lot of the time what happens is solutions that are primarily meant for OECD countries, so that's the priority. The OECD is not thinking, its first thought is not developing economies, Africa, it's OECD countries themselves. They think of those solutions for OECD countries, and then later on they bring on board the African countries to say, we've come up with this solution, you can also implement it, it can work in your specific countries. And many a time you find that those solutions are out of touch because they don't take cognizance of the position of African countries. And essentially what we want is a situation where from the start, when we have identified a problem and when we're addressing a solution, African countries are on the table. The same way that the Netherlands is influencing and shaping that tax policy is the same way that we want Kenya or Nigeria to have the same level of influence, not where it comes from the top going down to the bottom. And that's the challenge with the system we have now.
Yeah, thanks. That's what we hear a lot, that things are decided already by the secretariat of the OECD. Of course, there are many differences in the sense that there are capital exporting countries and capital importing countries. So yeah, you don't have the same position. The head offices are here as well, and that is important for this minimum tax, for example. If that's where the tax is raised.
Exactly.
What I found interesting, Aisha, that you took us a little bit through history, and what's interesting indeed is actually that the United Nations was in the lead until 1954. And if we can manage to get them in the lead again, which would be great, what can we learn from what happened then that we cannot repeat it, that now they will stay in the lead? I'm very optimistic that they will be in the lead.
So yes, as the saying says, those who fail to acknowledge history are most likely to repeat it. So yes, historical context is very important. And what I learned from that was that it is hard to get many countries to agree on one thing. The most you can do is try to, as he has mentioned, look at each person's priorities, and then people put in the resources into meeting up with their priorities and focusing on those. And so, for instance, before I joined IBFD, I was in tax administration. And under tax administration, I was negotiating in some of the roles under the OECD.
Was of Nigeria?
Yes, of Nigeria. I'm from Nigeria, just as a note. And what was our key challenge? Our key challenge wasn't the fact that we weren't allowed to participate. You were allowed to participate. But then the issue was a capacity issue. You would see a situation whereby a topic is being brought up in Africa, where we just start having more comprehensive and intricate kind of tax systems that tend to be a little bit complicated, are introducing new rules. But then you'd see a country that has introduced said rules since 1972 on the same table. And they would come with 5 experts to the negotiation, and you are one person representing your country that is probably the only person that knows about the topic. And they release these documents which you're to read and to put comments to. And the next meeting is the night after, and you have like 200 pages to read and comment on it. And at the end of the day, it doesn't take into any consideration the capacity of these countries in giving time to get into what is being discussed and look if it is of a priority for you.
So capacity is an issue.
Yeah, capacity.
But what our government says, but that we are addressing because we're helping with building up the capacity. So is that enough, or do we still miss something?
The thing is, I do see that there's a role also, there's an accountability that also has to be taken by each region in what you do to develop yourself and to help yourself. And one of the major things we pushed for in Nigeria was that would be in that meeting, and let's say just 3 African countries are there. It's not that other countries weren't involved in it, they just didn't send anyone to join the meetings. And it's a capacity issue, because even if one person comes there and they don't know anything that's going on, they just close their camera and do whatever they need to do. And at the end of the day, so you need to push more people to know what's going on and to be more invested in what's going on. ATAF tried to take a prominent role into the discussions because it saw this was a problem. But then what we lack in Africa is harmonization of discussions locally on issues. And that's what one of the things that was coming out from this UN Secretary General's roles. It said that you could also contribute by starting conversations regionally, and then you build up on what your priorities are and push them up and say, this is what we want to focus on. Because if you don't have anything to bring to the table,
so
then
you can
there's
join
nothing
forces.
to argue on.
And I think Nigeria was one of the countries that was indeed the most involved in the...
yes, we handed over the Secretary General the resolution.
Yeah, for example, but talking about the global minimum, but because of that was also against, because they knew you actually knew what was happening. So that's also a thing that you should be fully aware of what are the consequences. Henrique.
Yeah, just a very quick follow-up. I think it's interesting. So as you mentioned, the Dutch government and OECD countries in general, they do, let's say, put some, funding for capacity development, in developing countries. But what we see is that most of the time, let's say, the funding and the training is basically for the implementation of policies that have already been agreed at OECD level. At the other hand, what should actually happen is, of course, capacity development so that those countries can develop their own policies, develop their own positions. We shouldn't be, literally training them to implement what we have agreed. We should, have a discussion with them so that they are able also to, elaborate on their own position and their own views on fiscal policy. So the idea of capacity development, there's some nuance to that, and it's really important that nobody is being trained to implement rules that were created without them being in the discussion. Yeah.
Yeah, that's you would think that it would be obvious for everyone, but yeah, where it is, time is flying. But are there still questions? Yeah, I see a question over there.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Agnes. I work with ActionAid on climate justice.
Was ingeslapen.
Hi, I'm Agnes. I work with ActionAid on climate justice and specifically climate finance. And I thought it was especially interesting. I think, Henrique, you mentioned this thing of Ministry of Foreign Affairs versus Ministry of Finance. And I was actually at a meeting with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs last week talking about climate finance. And there is so much money needed for climate finance. So also I think the financing gap, I'm not sure if it included all of that as well for mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage. But then this person from the ministry said, oh yeah, but at the COP or at the UNFCCC, we don't discuss tax or we don't discuss debt. Whereas it's crazy to pay climate finance when countries are actually losing more out of tax evasion or repaying debt. So I'm wondering what you, I guess all three, see as potential to make these linkages to other UN platforms or other fora, because they are very connected, but my impression is that now they are not these connections are not so strong yet.
Shall we do one person? Who wants to?
Well, yeah, if I may, I can react quite quickly to it. I think, thank you for the question. One of the interesting aspects, when we're having the possibility of moving this to the UN is really that there is, the possibility or the potential of connecting tax to other priorities at UN level. So, also at the OECD and other forums, we're talking of taxation, and I feel there's very few linkages or connections to other issues. So one of the things that, for example, I believe yesterday there was a press conference from the Africa group in the UN, and one of the points that they raised was really this connection with climate. But of course, they have already mentioned also the importance of connecting tax to the SDGs and to other priorities. So I think, and this is one of the let's say the selling points when we're discussing moving these discussions to the UN is really that you would be able to connect tax to other UN priorities, and that would of course include climate. Yeah.
May I have a small reaction to this?
Yes.
One thing, so another small fact about me is I had a background in international relations, so I do see some things in the political lens of it. And one thing you need to know about government agencies is that different agencies have different mandates. What Ministry of Finance has to do is to raise revenue so that they can expend it for public services and goods. And so your priority is revenue, not fairness of what's happening in the world, but revenue. And then Ministry of Foreign Affairs is supposed to help with diplomatic relations. And so, two different objectives and two different ways of seeing an issue. And at sometimes it might be at a crossroads, because while a state has what we call tax sovereignty, and as a legitimate sovereign nation, you have a right to focus on your national interests. And if your interest at a certain point in time is raising revenues for development of your country, then the priorities of a global world is not your focus. You are focusing on your citizens, who are your primary objective as a nation. And so you have this crossroads where you have to choose and balance things. Because you have, on one hand, you have your taxpayers will say, what is my money being used for? And then you have to start talking about something, about caring about people in another place or some other crisis. So you have to balance these issues. But as he has mentioned, having these universal principles where we start thinking of equity is the focal point of what the UN is trying to do. And they have to target that. and put everyone on the same page where we say, this is what we want to look at. We are no more caring about our individual and personal interests, but we want to look at this bigger thing, and we care more about this bigger thing. So, for instance, we were talking about climate. We have a lot of discussions about climate and helping the environment. And I remember when I was in revenue, and we said, okay, we need to do something about an environmental tax. And why there was low resistance towards that was we said, well, we are underdeveloped. And to develop, you have to go through industrialization and mechanization of your economy to be able to produce and stop being a consumer economy. And to do that, you have to do it in the cheapest way. That means you have to look for not necessarily the most sustainable and environmental friendly ways of doing things. Coal would have been what you'd have done. And countries that are where they are now did all this and went through this, and they are developed. So telling me to stop doing my time and get a more expensive way of reaching my own development is unfair. And so that's why you see some little or less implementation towards such rules. So you have to, national interest plays a very key role in decision making, and politicization is very important.
That's the whole problem, the national interests, which is
so
always put first.
Focus should be on global universal principles. Thank you.
Shall we do a last question? Because I think we are at the end of time already.
In international newspapers like The Economist, you see that once in a while the Netherlands or a group of countries are negotiating, are having made negotiations with 1 or 3 African countries. And The Economist is critical about the results and why the negotiations are made in that fashion, rather unfair. But after all, is a result being booked? I'm not sitting for nothing in this room. I'm really interested in what is any progress being made, or is, let's say, the last 20 years, no progress being made in taxation, in fair taxation?
And then when you talk about negotiation, I guess you mean negotiation on taxes.
Yes,
So,
trade and taxes is very often the two things that are being negotiated in one go.
Tax treaties.
But is the reform then booked? Is any progress being made?
Yeah.
Fair, towards a fair direction?
Any of you? There's a lot to say about tax treaties. So that's you're opening a whole new book. Ishmael.
Yeah, so in a nutshell, I think so. The biggest shifts that we have seen with that regard are under the inclusive framework. I think it's been quite a milestone. The changes that we've seen. There is the multilateral instrument that was introduced under the inclusive framework, which looks at seeing how we can address treaty shopping in the double taxation agreements that you're making reference to that are being negotiated. And there are, of course, like any instrument that is being introduced, there's positives and there's negatives to the multilateral institute that is under the OECD that we have outlined. In addition to this, so just generally the biggest shifts are, again, what we spoke of, the 2-pillar proposal. We're looking at taxing digital economies and setting up a global minimum tax. And then lastly, the one we looked at, pushing global tax policy formulation under the UN. But maybe just, I don't know if Aisha, you may add on the MLI.
Okay, so for the MLI, which is the instrument here said that modifies taxes, they came with 2 major, so there were 2 action plans that keyed into that, and it was looking into aggressive tax planning. And there's Action 6 that has the minimum standards, which would fight against or cater against treaty shopping, which was the major problem with the Netherlands treaties. And then we had some other specific anti-avoidance rules that were optional for countries to take. When it comes to the options that were chosen, we saw that most of the developed countries chose just the minimum standards, and then the developing countries chose both the minimum standards and the special anti-avoidance rules. Now, with the ratification of the MLI, because yes, you have an instrument and you've signed and you said you want these treaties to be amended, the issue with the implementation is the Netherlands has ratified the MLI, but then many of the developing countries have not, because the ratification processes domestic ratification processes take a very long time. So that is what has happened, and capacity will still come again.
Yeah, capacity is also, but also if you're talking about this anti-avoidance rules, that would be great. Yeah, so you have anti-avoidance rules in the tax treaty. So, but then we get them more and more. But what we are wondering is, are they actually used? And it seems that they are not used. So on the basis of this anti-avoidance rule in the tax treaty, you could say as another country, like, okay, now we ask, because of this, we ask information from you, Netherlands. But these requests, first, a while ago, they said, well, we haven't got them yet. Now the Netherlands doesn't give information about it anymore. So the Ministry of Finance would have to do that. They say we don't keep track of it, which is strange, because you would know if another country officially asks you, I want to use this anti-avoidance rule. And it's also really difficult, because if the avoidance scheme is in the Netherlands, how do you know if you're in Kenya, for example, what is happening in the Netherlands? And so you have to get all the information. So what we say, the Netherlands has to proactively share this information if there's a avoidance set up, and then work together with these countries against tax avoidance. And then you are the last one.
Yeah.
And then, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes,
So just still rounding that on those double tax treaty agreements. Yeah, basically what we see, I believe it was in 2020, the Netherlands published a new tax policy memorandum, which was basically saying, that when negotiating tax treaties with developing countries, that they would really, take other things into consideration, such as development and other issues. But that's not what we see in practice. For example, right now, the Netherlands has been renegotiating a tax treaty with Uganda for a couple of years, which had a very low, let's say, it really reduced the capacity of Uganda to tax multinationals. And we see that the Netherlands is negotiating right now with Mozambique a tax treaty, which we work in Mozambique with other partner organizations. And we are really highlighting to the government in Mozambique, the possible revenue leaks that it can create. So yeah, the view of Oxfam, Novib, and a lot of other CSOs is really that the Netherlands continues to have this harmful role, and that while there are publications and policy papers saying that this has changed, we still don't see that in practice. So I would say the role of the Netherlands, unfortunately, seems to be steady fast. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's still work to do for the tax justice tax justice movement.
Yeah.
So thank you, Aisha, Ishmael, and Henrique. And thank you all. I think it's to the drinks now, or not? Yeah.
No, in 15 minutes we'll have a plenary session on the second floor. That is that way. If you need a toilet, the closest one is over there.